A particular kind of power exists that operates without public notice, not via press conferences or punishments or peaks, but via the patient accumulation of advantages structural, leverage built into the bones of a 60-year-long supply chain construct, and that no tariff schedule, regardless of how aggressive, can undo in one political concept. That is the narrative currently taking place in the North automotive industry in the United States. Also, Canada is the center of the country. To comprehend Canada's quiet nature gaining market share in the American auto industry, you must comprehend what America's actually tariff war has resulted, rather than Canada, which is the usual framing, but with regard to the United States itself. Because the paradox at the heart of this Washington's most famous story is that aggressive intervention by protectionists in a generation has in several measurable and documented methods that made Canada structurally improved automobile manufacturing essential for American customers and not less American industry. Begin with the fundamental structure. The automotive relationship between the United States and Canada is, to paraphrase the Canadian automobile, the Manufacturers Association is one of bilateral trade, is the most balanced relationships across the globe, including vehicles have a surplus deficit gap and approximately $900 million in parts. A number that accurately reflects statistics noise considering the size of the trade. Comtrade, as stated by the United Nations database, 11 were imported by the United States. Canadian automobiles worth billions of dollars parts in just 2025. That amount reflects something more fundamental than business. It shows how manufacturing is integrated. That started with the Auto Pact in 1965, the automotive products from the United States and Canada consent, and was consolidated through NAFTA, followed by CUSMA. The usual formulation is used again by business leaders and economists alike, is that no such thing as a car from Canada or an American car, a vehicle from North America exists. And in that car from North America, the contribution from Canada is not incidental. It carries loads. Canada in 2024 produced around 1.3 million light-duty automobiles in accordance with the data provided by the Canadian government, and of about 1.1 million of those were exported directly to the States of America. This indicates that the vast majority of what Ontario's factories produce reaches American parking lots. In Woodstock, the Toyota RAV4 was constructed. Ontario, the most popular compact SUV, both the United States and Canada, exits a Canadian train and enters garages in the U.S. at a rate of a little over 375,000 units annually. Ontario's Cambridge, identical Toyota Motor Corporation, the Lexus NX, is also produced at a facility in Canada, and the RX from Lexus. It is worthwhile to accept that final point. Outside of Japan, Canada is the only country constructing Lexus automobiles for export to the States of America. A Honda CR-V is a common sight in suburban America, manufactured in Ontario's Alliston. The most common minivan is the Chrysler Pacifica. On the American market, originates from Windsor. These are not insignificant products. These are leaders in their field. Now, implement the 2025 tariff shock and observe what transpires. The Trump administration launched its imposed tariffs of 25% on any vehicle that did not built in the United States of America. That tariff, as reported by S&P Global Mobility, which is used by about 46% out of the 16 million vehicles that were sold in prior to that, the domestic American market year. For automobiles built in Canada and Mexico within the framework of CUSMA, technically in effect, but with a crucial cutout that led to the significant structural variable CUSMA compliant. Automobile parts, the parts that cross the border as inputs as opposed to completed goods, were still exempt. This exclusion was not by chance. It exemplified the even within the Trump White House. That American automobile known as house without, manufacturing cannot function. Canadian material. General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, their U.S. manufacturing facilities are, according to a March 2025 White House statement, structured fact sheet around an integrated supply chain throughout North America. That supply chain would be destroyed, not safeguard American jobs. That would eliminate them. Canada clearly comprehended this dynamic. The Americans' response to Ottawa tariffs was, to paraphrase Prime Mark Carney, minister, carefully targeted and calibrated. Canada came close. The 25% tariff on automobiles assembled in the United States entering the market in Canada. However, it purposefully exempted a single auto components, a preciseness that the Conservatives' legal briefing is referred to as the primary distinction in structure between the tariff policies in the United States and Canada. The reasoning was precise. Canada lacked attempting to eliminate the integrated supply chain. It attempted to make use of that supply chain as a means of keeping Canadian capacity for production while negotiating a broader security and economic growth collaboration with Washington. And this is where the narrative truly develops intriguing from a strategic point of view. Since Canada didn't just impose tariffs in retaliation and wait, it created a remission architecture for compliance framework, which was successfully transformed production of automobiles in Canada transactions into a currency. The framework, put into action on April 15, 2025, permitted the importation of a certain number of vehicles from the United States that enter the Canadian market fight back. Free of charge, but only with certain conditions that they continue to produce a particular amounts in Canada. Ottawa evaluated each quarter whether businesses were achieving their anticipated production guidelines, those who were spared cuts to quotas, those that their access was preserved. The October 2025 saw the enforcement action. When François Philippe was Finance Minister of Champagne and Industry, Melanie Joly shared significant announcements. Decreases in import quotas of Stellantis and General Motors. General Motors had come to an end for good. Production of its electric BrightDrop vans used for delivery at the Ingersoll, Ontario facility and operations had been reduced. In Oshawa, Stellantis had abandoned building plans. The SUV Jeep Compass in its Brampton location. Assembly plant, which posed a threat roughly 3,000 direct jobs. The response from Ottawa was immediate. GM's the annual quota for remission was cut by 24.2%. The quota for Stellantis was reduced by 50%. The message from the Minister of Finance Champagne was crystal clear. These unacceptable choices have been made, violation of their legal responsibilities to workers in Canada and Canada. This was not a beg of the government. Multinationals should remain. It was a market, government with a mechanism access to tariffs of 25% and the will to put it to use. If you want to use the remission architecture, trace its sophisticated logic. The conventional, inverted relationship between the host nations and automakers worldwide. Normally, automakers have the upper hand. They could risk shifting production and subsidies and other government actions follow. Concessions. The framework of Canada changed. Those dynamics. The customer in Canada market, where consumers in Canada spend more than $110 billion annually only on vehicles and locations. Per capita, Americans buy more cars, became the means of enforcing the law. Access to customers in Canada was conditional on the preservation of Canadian production and gaining access to American market through supply that is CUSMA compliant chains added value to Canadian production. Maintaining. The automakers were identified between two types of leverage for access simultaneously. That position in the structure is the thing that RBC Wealth Management found. In a May 2026 investigation as the primary asset in Canada's position in negotiations prior to the joint CUSMA review, the examination required by Article 34.7 of the agreement needs to be held by July 1, 2026, a date that currently, as this script is being written. RBC provided 4 possible outcomes for Canada's auto industry, depends on examine the outcome, and even their highest scenarios that are pessimistic. The integrated nature of the supply in North America chain was found to be a limitation on how hostile any American administration actually could reorganize the original rules without putting American manufacturers at risk. According to the report, CUSMA, generally requires a vehicle to be 75% North American content prior to its entry into the border without import taxes. That requirement, paradoxically, safeguards American as well as Canadian suppliers' ones as a result of the North American source. Because of mandates, automakers cannot simply move to less expensive Asian content without losing their status as preferential tariffs entirely. In this context, the most significant incident in the Canadian in the first half of 2026, the auto industry is not the unsuccessful businesses. It is the non-existent one. Motor Toyota Canada's manufacturing industry is now the acceptance of nearly every analyst encompassing the industry, the clearest expression of what an automobile in Canada, what the future may look like. Toyota held a factory in January 2026. Visit its plant in Woodstock, Ontario, to emphasize the sixth launch RAV4 generation, now completely electric, each variant a crossover. The president, Tim Hollander of Canada's Toyota Motor Manufacturing, called it an important display of Toyota's faith in our workforce and our manufacturing ecosystem and plants. The business had put in $1.1 billion to reorganize the Cambridge and Woodstock plants so that the new battery packs in Ontario, RAV4s, could be built in-house, instead of being shipped from Japan. This June in 2025, this reorganization was completed. A vehicle that conforms to claims to have produced 4 million since 2009 in Canada, and which aims to sell 1 million units in Canada for the 30th anniversary of the RAV4, was now more deeply Canadian in 2026, not fewer. Bloomberg BNN claims that as Honda and Toyota in February 2026, together they make up 77% of the automobile production in Canada. That concentration in and of itself is a fact. Both businesses have a primary key models are produced in North America. Within Ontario, the U.S. plant does not have the capacity to move Canadian production to the south in the manner that is available to manufacturers based in Detroit. This geographic and financial lock-in that the Canadians for Toyota and Honda supply chain is not one of the choices. It's the chain of supply. Scott, when Mackenzie, the director of Toyota, it was asked about corporate and external affairs. Whether RAV4 production will continue in Ontario relied on a positive CUSMA outcome. He spoke openly in his circumspection. We think that the most efficient method is for the business in North America to work is integrated with all three of them. Participating nations. He stated that at January 2026 at the Woodstock plant, a situation without tariffs is ideal. That is polite language because we have made significant investments here and need this structure for survival. The picture is more difficult to understand and sincere when the EV chapter is included, because Canada's EV transition has not carried out as planned, and that matters for the course of the company's long-term, what Canada has to offer the United States market, the LG Energy and the Stellantis. The planned joint venture solution to make Windsor the foundation of the supply chain for batteries in North America has undergone a significant reorganization. Windsor's Nexstar Energy facility that cost $5 billion Canadian dollars to complete, in return for investments and received up to $1 billion of federal and formal provincial support commitments, inaugurated on March 5, 2026, however, with a pivot that informs you everything about the location of the EV market in fact is. Initially intended to primarily supply batteries for electric automobiles, Nexstar has altered its energy production on a large-scale data and power grid storage systems centers. Stellantis gave up its 49% stake in February to LG Energy Solution 2026 for what the business called in exchange for an undisclosed sum favorable advantages. LG now holds the sole owner with about 1,300 employees, and an additional 1,200 are anticipated after the entire operational. There is no failure here in any logical reasoning. Windsor, the facility is still the first in Canada, advanced commercial battery plant, as well as its shift to grid storage, demonstrates a logical response to the actual adoption rate of EVs as opposed to the anticipated rate. However, it is an acceptance of a more general pattern. Ford has abandoned its plans for electric vehicles. For Ottawa and Oakville in July 2024 offered 464.5 grants totaling $1 million Canadian encourage the switch to Super Duty gasoline instead of diesel pickup trucks. Bright Drop Electric was cancelled by General Motors, van manufacturing in Ingersoll, Honda as well, which announced a $15 billion EV in 2024, Alliston's manufacturing complex comprising 4 facilities, which materials for cathodes and battery production processing has been put on hold for good. That strategy Honda Canada verified severance in May 2026, citing, according to The Globe, and mails reporting and declining customer changes in demand and business conditions. The RBC analysis established the global scale of EV disruption at $70 billion in reductions in value in 2026. The route of electrification, as RBC is finished longer than it was originally. Forecast. However, the RBC report also emphasized that is absolutely necessary for the argument Canada is implicitly making in the American auto industry the sections in which EV and integration of software results in the most high-margin, high-value trucks and SUVs platforms precisely are the divisions where production in Canada is concentrated. Canada has used Ford F-Series vehicles, best-selling vehicle for 15 years in a row, The Honda CR-V and Toyota RAV4 dominate the SUV market in Canada. The profile of this truck and SUV aligns Canada's direct involvement with the highest content category and highest margin in the American automobile market. If the enlightenment of those segments proceeds at any rate that the market actually helps, the plants in Canada they are being made at the moment, to record that change, not to be omitted by it. In the interim, the trade. The story of diversification that runs alongside the drama in domestic production adds another facet of Canada's maneuvering. TD Economics' February 2026 issue Auto Industry Outlook, which noted that as of November 2025, the proportion of automobiles manufactured within the CUSMA region had reached an all-time low of about 65%. Imports from South Korea, Japan, and Germany has expanded, in part due to the comprehensive and continually expanding agreement as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, wherein Canadian automobile tariffs on in 2022, there were no more Japanese cars. Additionally, Prime Minister Carney reached an agreement in January 2026 with China to allow a predetermined quota of 49,000. At the moment, electric vehicles enter Canada. Tariff rate of 6.1% for the most favored nation, a quota that is comparable to the Chinese share of the market in Canada in the years 2023 and 2024. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, and some industry leaders voiced their opposition, considering the arrangement to be a contest threat to the manufacturing base of Ontario. However, from Ottawa's vantage point, additionally, Chinese vehicle quota was leverage. In the review of CUSMA, a signal to Washington claims that Canada has other options. Suppliers in the event that the American trading system gets worse, beyond a predetermined limit. The framework for the emission and the Chinese vehicle quota, which complies with CUSMA auto component exemption, production sanctions imposed on GM and Stellantis. These are not distinct policy choices. They are a part of the same thing. A strategic architecture that is made to make the most of Canada's positional advantage in the joint review in July 2026, while maintaining the integrity of the underlying supply chain for the automobile manufacturers that have kept their obligations in Canada. The U.S. launched by the International Trade Commission its own investigation into CUSMA rules of the automotive industry's origin in February 2026, in accordance with the terms of the agreement. The 2025 report of the Commission examining how the regulations have worked since the adoption of CUSMA revealed that investment automobile production in the United States had grew and auto parts manufacturers had seen rises in employment and revenue. The Motor and Equipment's Joe Volpe. According to the Manufacturers Association, the Canadian press reported that CUSMA had extremely profitable for U.S. component suppliers and that the content comes from Canada. There had remained within that framework. roughly stable, which refers to the configuration was not one-sided. American advancements did not come at the expense of Canada. That conclusion is important for the review in July, due to the fact that it undermines the administrative claim reiterated by Trump team members' team that has suffered as a result of CUSMA the auto industry in the U.S. The evidence that has been documented is precisely opposite. The 75% regional value of CUSMA, the need for content, has pushed production in both the North and the South inside the continent, not outside of it. It has made parts from Canada indispensable. Components of automobiles that are assembled qualifies as American, and it has resulted in that the $11 billion in auto sales in Canada, parts that the United States imported in 2025, not represent dependence, but integration. A combination that American businesses would suffer financially if broken more than Canadians pay for it, because American factories would need to rebuild the supply chains that are currently 60 years of experience affect efficiency. International Optimization Statistics, Canada's examination of in May 2026. Exports with added value generate employment. Magnitude of this starkness. In 2024, $113 billion in manufacturing value in Canada increased as a result of U.S. demand for exports of Canadian manufacturing, providing support for roughly 694,000 jobs in Canada. The same link between U.S. demand signifies that any American government deciding to significantly disrupt access to automobiles in Canada is concurrently deciding to disrupt the purchases are a demand from Canadian consumers. Approximately 25% to 30% of all vehicles in the United States exports. The largest exporter is Canada. Market for automobiles made in the USA. The tariff war, as noted by TD Economics in its outlook for February 2026, was only viable for the automobile industry in Canada due to CUSMA exemptions in 2025. But the reverse is also true. American auto sector's access to the consumer market in Canada, the market has been precisely maintained due to Ottawa's decision to calibrate its measures of retaliation carefully enough to preserve the operation of the integrated system. The phrase, quietly, in the title of this story deserves further investigation. Not in Canada. Gaining market share in the American auto market aggressively, unilaterally geopolitical or announcements confrontation. It is gaining popularity. Through the longevity of the structure, the fact that the majority of American vehicles families will purchase SUVs in 2026, and truck groups that produce the highest manufacturing margins disproportionately appear to be from Canada. Lines. It is expanding through the CUSMA's legal architecture, which will require the signatures of all three nations to enthusiastically accept any major changes to the rules of origin, formally granting Canada a veto over in terms of how it is being moved. It is gaining ground as a result of an absent structure that has made Canada great access to the market as a compliance instrument, and by means of the strategy for diversification has begun. Establishing new trade relationships to lessen its reliance on American uncompromising unilateralism, integrated system in North America that remains its primary financial advantage. The RBC study concluded that the Windsor-Montreal corridor potential to perform its function as a northern Silicon Valley concentrated on the skills of engineers for artificial intelligence, autonomy, materials that are lightweight and embedded automobile systems. McKinsey anticipated in 2026 that the control, sensors, and software, the electronics and unit segment of the global auto industry will expand. Between $520 and $335 billion from 2025 to 2035, the section where the long-term automobile value competition will be decided. And Canada, which possesses talent base and an ecosystem for manufacturing already incorporated into each major global manufacturer based in North America, is in a position to take part in that challenge raw production in ways the figures alone do not capture everything. None. All of this is certain. Economics at TD anticipates a 4.3% drop in Canadian automobile sales in 2026. In 2025, Canadian vehicle production declined by 5.4%, the greatest drop of any cost nation. Ford's and Honda's frozen $15 EV complex abandon Oakville's electrification aren't spin, but rather actual setbacks. The development of Automotive in Canada. Over time, competitiveness is, in TD's perspective, inversely related to the relative shift in tariff strategies following the CUSMA review. Yet the same structural position remains beneath longer lasting than the quarterly. The production figures suggest Canada remains, constructs the RAV4. The CRV is still built by it. It is still growing in the Pacifica. It continues to produce Lexus RX, the only location outside of Japan that is so. It has the first on the continent. Advanced battery plant for commercial use, currently operating completely in Windsor under ownership of LG Energy Solutions. Oakville is being retooled by Ford to produce the Super Duty, which ranks among the top revenue-generating programs in North America with 464 million elected officials production and support targeted prior at the close of 2026. Exports of auto parts from Canada to the United States grew by 2.3% in 2025, despite exports of finished automobiles decreased, a divergence that precisely reflects kind of necessity of the supply chain that tariffs are unable to easily remove. The political narrative emanating from Washington tells the tale as one about Canadian industrial revival rivals American expense. The production data provide additional complicated narrative, a result of 60 years of integration system where the price of disentanglement has an uneven impact on the group that would be required to rebuild completely new supply chains, that event not Canada. The $11. Annually flowing auto parts in Canada into American factories is not a vulnerability that must be fixed by Canada. They show that there is leverage. Position that there is currently no tariff schedule managed to get rid of. Additionally, the forthcoming CUSMA review will need to maneuver without damaging the very sector that both governments assert to act as a shield. Gaining ground means exactly that, quietly. Not by means of conflict, but through its necessity. Not via announcements, but rather through the supply chains, not in spite of the tax war, but in specific, quantifiable ways, owing to it.